Mackenzie Poltergeist of Greyfriars, the most violent documented poltergeist in History. It was a cold night in Edinburgh in 1999, and a homeless man was looking for somewhere to sleep. The city was quiet at that hour. The closes and winds of the old town had emptied out, and the wind coming off the Firth of Forth was the kind that finds its way through every layer you have on and settles in the bones. The man had been walking for a while. He needed shelter. He needed somewhere that was out of the wind and preferably out of sight. Somewhere he could get through the night without being moved on, or worse, he found himself at the gates of Greyfriars. Kirkyard. Greyfriars is one of Edinburgh's oldest graveyards, established in the late 1500s on the grounds of a former Franciscan monastery. It sits just south of the Royal Mile in the heart of the old town, its ancient stones pressing up against the backs of tenement buildings that have been watching over it for centuries. At night, with the gates closed and the city noise reduced, to a distant murmur, Greyfriars has the quality of a place that exists slightly outside of time. The headstones lean at angles that suggest the ground beneath them has been shifting for a very long time. The trees are old and dense. The shadows between them are absolute. The man found a section of the kirkyard that was locked behind its own set of gates. The Covenanters' Prison, it was called. A walled enclosure at the southern end of the graveyard where 300 years earlier, over 1,000 men had been imprisoned in the open air and left to die through a Scottish winter. He found a way through. Inside the prison, there was a building, a large domed mausoleum, the finest tomb in the kirkyard, belonging to a man named Sir George Mackenzie, who had died in 1691. The man tried the door. It was locked, but the lock was old and the building was old, and there was a gap, a weakness in the structure, and he found his way inside. He descended a staircase into the darkness. Below, in the lower chamber, he found the coffins of the Mackenzie family arranged in the dark as they had been for centuries. He moved toward them. Perhaps he was looking for somewhere flat to sleep. Perhaps, in the darkness and the cold, he was not thinking clearly about where exactly he was or whose house he had broken into. He reached the coffins, and then the floor beneath him gave way. He dropped. Beneath the lower chamber of the Mackenzie mausoleum was an older burial pit filled with the remains of plague victims from Edinburgh's medieval past. The man fell into it in the darkness, landing among bones that had been undisturbed for hundreds of years. In an absolute panic, unable to see, surrounded by the dead, he somehow clawed his way back out. He ran from the mausoleum. He ran through the Covenanters' Prison. He ran out of Greyfriars Kirkyard and into the street where a local dog walker, out late with her animal, saw him emerge from the gates in a state of complete terror. The dog refused to go near the gates. The man left. The dog walker left. The kirkyard settled back into its nighttime quiet, but something had changed. Something that had been still for a very long time was no longer still. Something that had been contained within the walls of that domed mausoleum had been disturbed, had been woken, had been given a reason to come out. Within weeks, the attacks began to understand what happened next. You need to understand what Greyfriars Kirkyard is and what it contains. And to understand that, you need to go back 300 years to one of the darkest chapters in Scottish history, and to the man whose name has been attached to the most violent and most extensively documented poltergeist case in recorded history. His name was Sir George Mackenzie, and the people of Edinburgh called him Bloody MacKenzie for reasons that are entirely justified. George Mackenzie was born in 1636 and rose through the Scottish legal establishment with considerable speed and considerable ruthlessness. By 1677, he was Lord Advocate for Scotland, the most senior legal officer in the country, serving under King Charles II. He was, by all accounts, an intelligent man and, in some respects, a complex one. He founded the Advocates' Library in Edinburgh, which eventually became the National Library of Scotland, and he wrote works of philosophy and literature that were respected in his time. He was not a simple man, but he was a man who, when given power and a mandate to use it, used it with a thoroughness that left a mark on Scottish history that has not faded in 350 years. The conflict that defined Mackenzie's career and his legacy was the struggle between the Scottish Presbyterian Church, the Covenanters, and the Crown's attempts to impose Anglican religious practices on Scotland. The Covenanters had signed the National Covenant in 1638, declaring that God, not the king, was the head of the church, and that no earthly monarch had the right to dictate the form their worship would take. This was a position that successive Stuart kings found intolerable and that they attempted with increasing violence to suppress. Mackenzie was the instrument of that suppression. As Lord Advocate, he prosecuted Covenanters with a ferocity that earned him his nickname. He oversaw a period known as the Killing Time, from roughly 1679 to 1688, during which Covenanters were hunted, imprisoned, tortured, and executed for the crime of practicing their faith outside the structures the Crown had approved. Estimates of the total number who died during the persecution Mackenzie oversaw ranged from 5,000 to 18,000. The numbers are disputed, but the scale of the suffering is not. The event that brought Mackenzie's persecution into Greyfriars Kirkyard itself occurred in 1679 after the Battle of Bothwell Brig, where government troops crushed a Covenanter uprising. 1,200 prisoners were taken to Edinburgh and imprisoned in the open-air enclosure at the southern end of Greyfriars Kirkyard, the area now known as the Covenanters' prison. They were given almost no food, almost no water, and no shelter whatsoever from the Scottish winter. Guards were instructed to treat them with maximum severity. Those who refused to swear allegiance to the Crown and renounce the Covenant were held indefinitely. Most of them died there, in that enclosure, within sight of the mausoleum that would later be built for the man responsible for putting them there. Those who survived were mostly transported to plantations in the Americas or executed. By the end of 1679, of the 1,200 men who had entered the Covenanters' prison, only 48 remained. Mackenzie himself died in 1691, having fled to England when William of Orange came to the throne and restored religious freedom to Scotland. The very freedom Mackenzie had spent his career destroying. He was brought back to Edinburgh and buried in Greyfriars, in the finest tomb in the Kirkyard, a few hundred feet from the prison where his victims had died. The irony of his burial location was noted at the time and has been noted ever since. The man who imprisoned and killed the Covenanters was given his eternal rest in the same ground where they had suffered and died. Whatever George Mackenzie was, he was not a man who had chosen his neighbors carefully. For nearly 300 years after his burial, nothing particularly unusual was reported at the mausoleum. There were stories, as there always are with Edinburgh's older buildings and older graves. Robert Louis Stevenson wrote about children daring each other to knock on the mausoleum door and shout the rhyme that Edinburgh schoolboys had been chanting for generations: Bloody MacKenzie, come oot if the door, and then running away laughing. But nothing came out. The mausoleum sat in its corner of the Covenanters' prison, domed and silent, and whatever was inside it appeared content to stay inside it until the night in 1999, when a homeless man broke the lock and fell into the pit below. The first attack was reported within weeks of the break-in. A woman visiting Greyfriars Kirkyard on a tour felt something strike her on the side of the face with enough force to leave a bruise. There was no one near her. Nothing had fallen. Object was found. She was struck by something that was not there. Then a man was pushed off his feet near the entrance to the Covenanters' prison, pushed hard with intent by something behind him. He fell and hit the ground and lay there for a moment trying to understand what had happened, because what had happened was that he had been shoved by something invisible in an old Edinburgh graveyard in the middle of the afternoon, and there was no framework available to him for making sense of that. Then people started coming out of the Covenanters' prison with scratches on their skin. Not scratches from brushing against stonework or old iron railings, scratches on parts of their bodies that had been covered by clothing, scratches on backs and arms and necks and stomachs that appeared during the time they spent inside the prison, and that were not there before they entered. Then people started collapsing, not fainting in the way that people faint when they are overheated or overwhelmed, collapsing suddenly and completely, dropping to the ground unconscious without warning, and waking minutes later with no memory of falling, and sometimes with bruises that had not been there before. One woman was found unconscious near the mausoleum, with bruising around her throat. She had no explanation for how it had got there. She had not fallen on her neck. She had not tripped or walked into anything. Something had gripped her throat while she was inside the Covenanters' prison, and she had no memory of it happening. Jan Andrew Henderson was an Edinburgh-based historian and author who became one of the primary investigators and documentarians of what was happening at Greyfriars. He was not a ghost hunter in the theatrical sense. He was a writer and researcher who recognized that what was being reported at the Kirkyard was extraordinary enough to require serious documentation. He founded City of the Dead tours, which operated walking tours of Greyfriars and gave him legitimate access to the Covenanters' prison and to the witnesses of everything that occurred there. Over the years, he collected hundreds of documented accounts of attacks, injuries, and encounters. He interviewed witnesses. He cataloged incidents. He lived for a significant period in a house that overlooked the Covenanters' prison, as close to the source of the phenomena as it was possible to get, while still technically being outside it. What he documented over the years that followed is a record of paranormal violence that has no equivalent anywhere in the literature of unexplained phenomena. Not in scale, not in consistency, and not in the quality and independence of the witnesses involved. The attacks were not confined to a single type of experience. They were varied and physical and left evidence on the bodies of the people who experienced them. Visitors were scratched, visitors were bruised, visitors were burned, small circular burns that appeared on skin during the tour, and that witnesses described as feeling like being touched by something extremely cold, followed immediately by a burning sensation. Hair was pulled, limbs were grabbed. People reported being followed by an unseen presence that they could feel behind them even, when they could see there was nothing there. The most severe incidents involved people being knocked completely off their feet by a force that struck them from behind or from the side with the impact of a physical blow. Several people required medical attention after collapsing or being knocked to the ground. One man was thrown against the wall of the Covenanters' prison hard enough to leave marks on the stonework behind him. Animals consistently refused to enter the area around the mausoleum. Dogs on leads would stop at the entrance to the Covenanters' prison and plant their feet and refuse to move forward, regardless of how their owners encouraged or directed them. On multiple occasions, dogs that had been in Greyfriars without incident on previous visits began barking at the mausoleum without provocation and could not be quieted or moved away until they were taken entirely out of the Kirkyard. Dead animals began appearing in front of the black mausoleum. Birds, mostly, found unmarked, without injury, without any apparent cause of death, arranged in front of the mausoleum's door as though they had simply dropped out of the air. No predator marks, no evidence of collision or impact, just dead and placed and inexplicable. Cameras stopped working inside the Covenanters' prison. This was reported so consistently and by such a wide variety of witnesses using such a wide variety of equipment that Henderson eventually stopped treating it as an anomaly and started treating it as a reliable indicator of the entity's proximity. Watches stopped, electronic equipment malfunctioned, batteries drained in minutes inside the prison that had held full charges when their owners entered it. The phenomenon was consistent, repeatable, and had no conventional explanation that anyone who investigated it was able to supply. By the early 2000s, the number of documented incidents at Greyfriars had reached into the hundreds. Henderson's records contained account after account from witnesses who had no prior connection to each other and no prior belief in the paranormal, many of whom had visited the Kirkyard as skeptics and left it as something else entirely. The Council of the City of Edinburgh, which owned and maintained Greyfriars Kirkyard, was sufficiently concerned about what was happening that it locked the Covenanters' prison and restricted access to organized tours only. The locking of the gates did not stop the attacks. It simply meant that the attacks now happened to a more organized and more carefully documented set of witnesses. The phenomena showed a characteristic that Henderson noted with particular interest and that other investigators who studied the case found deeply significant. The entity appeared to be selective. In a group of 20 or 30 people entering the Covenanters' prison together, the attack, when it came, would target a single individual. Other people standing immediately next to that person would feel nothing. The entity did not strike indiscriminately. It chose, it selected. It appeared to exercise something that resembled judgment about who it would touch and who it would leave alone. What criteria it used for that selection was never established, but the selectivity itself was consistent enough across hundreds of incidents to be considered a reliable feature of its behavior. Henderson later described the Mackenzie Poltergeist as the best documented supernatural case in history. He was not speaking from enthusiasm or promotional interest. He was speaking from the position of someone who had spent years collecting evidence, interviewing witnesses, and living alongside something that had given him every reason to take it seriously. His conclusion, stated carefully and with the qualifications appropriate to someone who had thought deeply about what he was saying, was this: if the Mackenzie Poltergeist is not a genuine supernatural entity, then there is probably no such thing as a genuine supernatural entity, because the evidence for its existence is as strong as the evidence for anything of this kind is ever likely to be. The Church of Scotland was eventually asked to respond to what was happening at Greyfriars. This was not a decision that was taken lightly or quickly. The Church of Scotland is a Presbyterian institution, the spiritual descendants, in a very direct historical sense, of the Covenanters that George Mackenzie had imprisoned and killed. The idea that Mackenzie's spirit or some force connected to him was now attacking people in the graveyard where his victims had died was not a theologically comfortable proposition for an institution that preferred to maintain a cautious public distance from claims of supernatural phenomena. But the evidence was too consistent and too widely reported to ignore entirely, and eventually the decision was made to attempt an exorcism of the Black Mausoleum and the area surrounding it. The first exorcism was performed by a minister of the Church of Scotland with the appropriate authority and the appropriate ritual. It was conducted properly, with the seriousness that the Church brings to such matters when it decides they require attention. The minister spent time in the Covenanters' prison. He performed the rite. He blessed the ground and the mausoleum, and the surrounding area. He left. The attacks resumed the following week, not diminished, not reduced in frequency or severity. Resumed at exactly the same level at which they had been occurring before the exorcism, as though the ritual had not happened. As though whatever was in the mausoleum had noticed the exorcism and filed it away as irrelevant information. A second exorcism was arranged. A different minister this time, with perhaps slightly different hope that a different approach or a different individual might produce a different result. The ritual was performed. The Covenanters' prison was blessed again. The minister left. The attacks resumed within days. Both exorcisms failed completely and unambiguously. There was no period of reduced activity following either attempt that could be interpreted as partial success. The entity simply absorbed the spiritual intervention directed at it and continued. This was consistent with what had been observed in other well-documented poltergeist cases: the Calvados haunting, the Black Monk of Pontefract, where religious intervention produced temporary calm at best and no lasting effect at all. But in those cases, the entity had at least paused. At Greyfriars, there was no pause. The Mackenzie Poltergeist did not acknowledge the exorcisms in any way that the investigators or the church were able to identify. Shortly after the second failed exorcism, a spiritualist medium named Colin Grant decided to attempt what the church had been unable to accomplish. Grant was a professional in his field, known in Edinburgh's spiritualist community, and he had a genuine belief in his ability to communicate with and ultimately pacify whatever was present in the Covenanters' prison. He visited Greyfriars. He conducted his work with the seriousness that his tradition demanded. He engaged with whatever was there. A few weeks later, Colin Grant died of a heart attack. He was not an old man. He was not in particularly poor health. His death was sudden and unexpected, and it came shortly enough after his work at the mausoleum that everyone in Edinburgh's paranormal research community noticed the timing, even if they were careful about what conclusions they drew from it. Whether his death was connected to whatever he had encountered at Greyfriars is not provable. It is also not dismissible. Jan Andrew Henderson noted it in his records without dramatic embellishment, but also without dismissal. It was a fact. It had a sequence. The sequence was uncomfortable. He wrote it down. Then, the fire happened. Henderson's house. The house that overlooked the Covenanters' prison. The house where he had lived while conducting his investigation. The house that contained years of collected evidence, witness statements, photographs, letters, records, and documentation of everything that had been reported at Greyfriars since 1999. Burned down. The offices of City of the Dead tours burned down at the same time. All of the records they contained were destroyed. An official cause for the fire. was never established. The surrounding properties were not damaged. Henderson lost everything he had accumulated across years of investigation, every piece of paper, every photograph, every statement in a fire that no one could explain and that consumed only the buildings most directly connected to the investigation of the Mackenzie Poltergeist. He later described this in terms that were understated to the point of being chilling. He said simply that he did not know what had caused the fire. He said that whatever the Mackenzie Poltergeist was, a supernatural entity, a demon, a psychosomatic mass phenomenon, something else entirely, it had managed, whether intentionally or otherwise, to destroy the most comprehensive physical record of its own existence. Henderson rebuilt. He continued the tours, he continued the documentation, he continued to live alongside the case with the particular combination of professional dedication and personal wariness that years of proximity to something genuinely inexplicable tends to produce in the people willing to stay with it. The Covenanters. Prison remained locked except for organized tours. The attacks continued. The total number of documented incidents climbed past 500 and kept climbing. People continued to enter the prison as skeptics and leave it as something else. The mausoleum continued to sit in its corner of the Kirkyard, domed and patient. And whatever was inside it continued to make its presence known to the people who came close enough to feel it. A question that researchers, investigators, historians, and the simply curious have been trying to answer since. 1999 is the same question that every paranormal case eventually forces you to confront. What is it? The theories that have been proposed about the Mackenzie Poltergeist are numerous and range from the straightforwardly skeptical to the genuinely unprecedented. And none of them has succeeded in providing an explanation that accounts for all of the observed facts without requiring assumptions that the evidence does not support. The skeptical position holds that the hundreds of documented attacks are the product of a combination of suggestion, expectation, and the particular psychological conditions produced by visiting a genuinely historic and emotionally weighted location at night. The Covenanters' prison is a place where real atrocities occurred. The ground there contains the remains of people who died badly far from home for their beliefs. Walking into that space at night with a guide who is telling you about the history and the attacks and the entity in the mausoleum produces a psychological state in which you are primed to interpret any physical sensation, a gust of wind, a muscle twitch, a stumble on uneven ground, as an attack. The scratches can be self-inflicted without the witness's awareness. The bruises can come from stumbling in the dark. The collapses can be the product of anxiety and hyperventilation in people who have worked themselves into a state of genuine fear. This explanation is coherent. It accounts for some of the reported phenomena. It does not account for all of them. It does not account for the physical evidence on witnesses who were not told they would be attacked before entering. Who entered as skeptics with no expectation of anything unusual, and who emerged with marks on their bodies that had not been there before. It does not account for the consistency of the phenomena across hundreds of witnesses of different ages, backgrounds, nationalities, and belief systems over a period of more than 2 decades. It does not account for the dead animals at the mausoleum. It does not account for the consistent behavior of dogs. It does not account for the electronic equipment failures. And it does not account for the 2 failed exorcisms, except by noting that exorcisms are not conventional interventions, and their failure means only that a ritual believed by some to have power over spiritual entities was found not to have that power in this case, which is not itself a surprising outcome from a strictly skeptical perspective. The paranormal position holds that George Mackenzie, or some force generated by the weight of suffering associated with his actions, or some entity that is attached itself to his remains and the ground around them, is genuinely present in the Covenanters' prison and is genuinely responsible for the physical attacks on visitors. This position is supported by the scale and consistency of the documented evidence. It is not supported by any framework that the mainstream scientific community is willing to engage with as a legitimate explanation for physical phenomena. A third position, which some researchers have found more intellectually satisfying than either of the above, holds that the Mackenzie Poltergeist is real in a sense that neither conventional science nor conventional supernatural belief adequately describes. The Scottish academic and parapsychologist Archie Roy, who spent decades studying cases of this kind, argued that the evidence from Greyfriars pointed to something that was operating through mechanisms that current science does not yet have the tools to investigate properly. Not because the phenomena are impossible, but because the investigative frameworks available have not yet caught up with the phenomena themselves. This is not a comfortable position for anyone who wants a clean answer, but it may be the most honest one available given the evidence. The Mackenzie Poltergeist has been observed by hundreds of independent witnesses over more than 2 decades. It has been investigated by serious people with serious credentials. It has survived 2 exorcisms, the death of a medium and a fire that destroyed the records of its own investigation. It continues to operate in the Covenanters' prison of Greyfriars Kirkyard in Edinburgh today. Tours still run. People still enter the locked gates. People still come out with marks on their bodies that were not there when they went in. The mausoleum is still there. The domed roof still rises above the walls of the Covenanters' prison. The door is still locked. The bones of George Mackenzie are still inside it, along with whatever else has taken up residence in the ground around him, in the ground where his victims died, in the darkness beneath the floor, where a homeless man fell into a pit of plague bones on a cold Edinburgh night in 1999 and woke something up. The tours depart from outside the Kirkyard gates. The guides tell the history. The groups enter the Covenanters' prison. The gate closes behind them. And then they wait to see who it chooses. It has been choosing someone almost every time for more than 25 years. It is not finished. It has never been finished. And Bloody MacKenzie, who was never in his life a man who left things incomplete, appears to have carried that particular quality with him into whatever comes after. To understand why the Mackenzie Poltergeist is different from every other documented case of paranormal violence, you need to spend more time with the history that produced it. Because the history is not simply context for the haunting. The history is the haunting. The suffering that occurred in that walled enclosure in Greyfriars Kirkyard was not abstract or distant or statistical. It was specific, prolonged, and inflicted with full awareness of what it was doing to the people on the receiving end of it. The 1,200 men who were marched into the Covenanters' prison in 1679 were not criminals. They were not violent men, or at least the great majority of them were not. They were farmers and tradesmen and ministers and school teachers who had made the decision that their conscience required them to worship in a particular way, and that no king had the authority to tell them otherwise. That decision in the Scotland of 1679, under the Lord Advocateship of George Mackenzie, was sufficient to get you imprisoned in an open-air enclosure in a graveyard through a Scottish winter with almost nothing to eat and nowhere to sleep. The conditions in the Covenanters' prison have been described by historians who have studied the contemporary records with a consistency that leaves no room for ambiguity. The prisoners were given 5 pence per day for food at the beginning of their imprisonment, an amount that was later reduced and then stopped entirely. They had no shelter beyond what they could improvise from their own clothing. The enclosure was open to the sky. The winter of 1679 was by contemporary accounts particularly severe, with temperatures that killed healthy men who had access to warmth and food. The men in the Covenanters' prison had neither. They slept on the ground. They had no sanitation. Disease moved through them with the speed and thoroughness that overcrowded. Undernourished, immunocompromised populations have always been vulnerable too. The guards who oversaw them were instructed to maintain strict discipline and to shoot anyone who attempted to escape. Several men were shot. Others died of exposure. Others died of disease. Others died of what the contemporary records describe simply as weakness, a category that encompasses the specific kind of death that comes to people when their bodies have been given nothing to work with for long enough. Of the 1,200 men who entered the Covenanters' prison in 1679, approximately 400 died there. The remainder were eventually released on condition of swearing allegiance to the crown, transported to the Americas in ships where a significant number died en route, or executed publicly as examples. the ground of the Covenanters' prison contains. Those 400 men, they are still there. They have never been exhumed or properly commemorated or given the kind of formal acknowledgement that the scale of what happened to them arguably demands. They are in the ground, in the earth, beneath the feet of every tourist who enters the locked gate and waits to see whether the entity that woke in 1999 will decide they are worth its attention. George Mackenzie knew what he was doing to those men. He was not an ignorant man or a careless one. He was the most senior legal mind in Scotland, a man who had spent his career thinking carefully about the relationship between power and its consequences. He chose the conditions of the Covenanters' prison. He sanctioned them. He maintained them. And then he died and was brought back to Edinburgh and was buried in the finest tomb in the Kirkyard where those men had suffered and died, within sight of the enclosure where he had left them. Some locations carry what they have witnessed in ways that science does not yet have adequate language for. The ground of the Covenanters' prison carried 400 deaths and the particular quality of suffering that comes from prolonged, deliberate, systematic deprivation inflicted on people who had done nothing to deserve it. Whether that weight can produce phenomena of the kind that have been documented since 1999 is a question that depends on your prior beliefs about the nature of consciousness, the persistence of suffering, and the relationship between human experience and the physical world. But it is worth sitting with the weight of what happened there before you try to assess the weight of what is reported to be happening there now. The investigators who brought scientific equipment into the Covenanters' prison in the years following the first attacks found things that they could measure but not explain. Temperature anomalies were recorded, sudden drops of several degrees in areas of the prison that had no obvious cause, occurring in the absence of air currents or changes in weather conditions that could account for them. The drops were localized. They would occur in a space of perhaps a few square feet while the temperature immediately surrounding that space remained unchanged. Investigators standing adjacent to the cold spot would feel nothing, while the person standing in it would experience a pronounced chill, electromagnetic field readings. Taken inside the Covenanters' prison showed fluctuations that the investigators could not correlate with any obvious electromagnetic source. The Kirkyard is surrounded by the city of Edinburgh. There are buildings nearby, electrical infrastructure in the streets, but the fluctuations recorded inside the prison did not match the patterns that would be expected from external electromagnetic sources. They were irregular, localized, and occasionally very pronounced, spiking in a way that the investigators noted was consistent with what other paranormal researchers had reported at other locations where significant phenomena had been documented. The electronic failures that witnesses had been reporting since the earliest days of the haunting were recorded by the scientific teams as well. Cameras that had been functioning normally outside the prison stopped working inside it. Batteries that had been fully charged drained in minutes. On one occasion, a video camera that had been recording throughout the tour of the Kirkyard stopped, recording at the exact moment the group entered the Covenanters' prison and resumed recording at the exact moment they left it. The footage from inside the prison was simply absent, not corrupted, not damaged, just not there, as though something had decided with considerable precision that it did not want to be recorded, that the investigator who documented this particular incident noted with considerable restraint that the selective nature of the electronic failure, beginning and ending at the precise boundaries of the Covenanters' prison, was difficult to account for through any conventional mechanism. External electromagnetic interference would not recognize the boundaries of an old stone enclosure. A faulty battery would not choose to fail inside a specific location and recover outside it. Whatever was causing the equipment to fail appeared to be aware of where the investigation was happening and was responding to it. Accordingly, this observation connects to the broader characteristic of the Mackenzie Poltergeist, that investigators have consistently found the most difficult to account for within any conventional framework. The entity at Greyfriars does not behave like a random physical phenomenon. It behaves like something with awareness. It selects its targets. It responds to the presence of investigators. It appears to have opinions about being documented. It failed to respond to 2 exorcisms. It responded to a medium's attempt to pacify it by producing a sequence of events that ended with that medium's death and may or may not have been connected to it. It responded to years of documentation by burning down the buildings that contain that documentation. Each of those individual observations can be explained away. The target selection is suggestion and confirmation bias. The medium's death is coincidence of timing. The fire is an unconnected event that happened to occur in buildings associated with the investigation. But the accumulation of them, the pattern that emerges when you line them all up and look at them together, is the thing that serious investigators have found impossible to dismiss. Coincidences accumulate up to a point. Beyond that point, they start to look like something else. The Mackenzie Poltergeist is still active. This is not a historical case in the way that Calvados Castle is a historical case, or the Black Monk of Pontefract is a historical case. Those hauntings ended. The families left. The activity ceased. Whatever was present in those locations is no longer reliably reporting for duty. The Mackenzie Poltergeist has been active and consistent for more than 25 years and shows no sign of diminishing. City of the Dead Tours continues to operate. The tours enter the Covenanters' prison on a regular basis. The incidents continue to be reported and documented. The scratches and bruises and sudden collapses and electronic failures and cold spots and the animals that refuse to approach the mausoleum are not historical reports from the 1990s and early 2000s. They are current. They're happening. People visiting Edinburgh today, booking a ghost tour of Greyfriars Kirkyard as an evening's entertainment, are entering the Covenanters' prison and coming out with marks on their bodies that were not there before. The city of Edinburgh knows this. The council that locks the gates knows this. The Church of Scotland that attempted 2 exorcisms knows this. The academic and scientific investigators who have brought equipment into the prison and watched it fail know this. And none of them have been able to stop it, explain it, or make it go away. What do you do with that? The honest answer is that most institutions do what institutions always do when confronted with evidence that does not fit within their operational frameworks. They file it, they note it. They do not quite dismiss it, but they do not quite accept it either. Because accepting it would require them to revise their understanding of what is possible and what is not. And institutional revision of that kind is slow and uncomfortable and tends not to happen until the evidence becomes so overwhelming that the cost of not revising is higher than the cost of revising. The evidence from Greyfriars is already overwhelming by any ordinary standard of documentation. Hundreds of independent witnesses, physical evidence on bodies, scientific measurements of anomalous phenomena, the failure of 2 formally conducted religious rituals, the death of a medium, a fire, 25 years of consistent, ongoing, documented activity in a locked enclosure in the middle of one of Europe's most visited cities. What would it take for the evidence to be overwhelming by an extraordinary standard? It is genuinely difficult to say, because the Mackenzie Poltergeist has already produced more documented evidence of its existence than almost any other case in the history of paranormal investigation, and the institutions that could formally acknowledge it have chosen not to. This is not because the investigators are incompetent or dishonest. It is because the conclusion the evidence points toward requires a revision of the materialist framework that those institutions operate within. And that revision has consequences that extend far beyond a single graveyard in Edinburgh. If the Mackenzie Poltergeist is real, in the sense that the evidence suggests it might be, if something genuinely survives death, if suffering genuinely persists in locations where it was inflicted, if the dead can, under some circumstances, interact with the physical world in ways that leave marks on the bodies of the living, then the implications of that go considerably beyond what happened to a homeless man in a mausoleum in 1999. They touch on questions about consciousness and its relationship to the physical body, about the nature of identity and its persistence, about what we owe the dead and what the dead are capable of demanding from us. These are not questions that any institution is currently equipped to answer, and so the institutions tend to avoid asking them directly. The ground of the Covenanters' prison asks them directly every time someone enters the locked gates and comes out changed, Greyfriars Kirkyard is open to the public during the day. The Covenanters' prison is locked except for the tours. The black mausoleum stands in its corner behind the gates, domed and patient. The headstones of the Kirkyard lean at their ancient angles in the Edinburgh rain. The city moves around it, over it, through it, tourists and commuters and students, and the ordinary apparatus of a living European city going about its business. Within yards of a place that has been documenting something extraordinary for a quarter of a century, the bones of George Mackenzie are in the mausoleum. The bones of 400 Covenanters are in the ground around it. Whatever relationship exists between those two sets of remains, between the men who ordered the suffering and the men and women who endured it, is being expressed through the bodies of the people who walk into that enclosure and find themselves selected. History does not always stay where you put it. Sometimes it reaches back. And in the Covenanters' prison of Greyfriars Kirkyard, in the city of Edinburgh, on whatever night you choose to visit, something that has been reaching back for 25 years is still reaching, still choosing, still making itself known in the only language it appears to have left, the language of contact, of impact, of something cold and deliberate, pressing itself against the skin of the living and leaving a mark that was not there before. Go if you want to. The tours depart in the evening. The guide will tell you the history. The gates will close. Behind you, and then you will find out whether it has anything to say to you specifically. Most people come out unmarked, but not everyone dots, and the ones who do not come out unmarked never quite forget what it felt like to be chosen by something that has been waiting in that ground since 1679. Patient as the dead are patient, angry as only the truly wronged can be angry, and absolutely certain that it is not finished yet.